Chapter 3. Joe versus Death. Despite her bravado, Joe was floundering. She didn't know how to react. She almost couldn't. This was the worst case scenario. The Soul Takers were back, and as insane as it seemed, even to someone who had seen it, this newest Soul Taker seemed even stronger than Karen and her allies. Joe tried desperately to rationalize her friend's loss. They had been limited in many ways by the rules of the official match. At one point, their opponent had been down. They could have finished him then and there if it had not been for the 10 count. However, if Jen and Tucker had been limited by the rules of the match, then that meant that their opponent had been too. There was no telling what powers and techniques he might have that he simply couldn't use without the match being ended and every soul wielder in the building intervening. Yet none of that mattered. No matter who this guy was or how worried he made her, he'd issued Joe a challenge, and she'd accepted. He had injured 2 of her friends, and he had called her out. Her pride wouldn't allow her to back down, or even hesitate for long. At Joe's side, Sarah looked around frantically. "Joe, do you know where he went? Where he is?" Joe looked around as well, and she caught the last glimpse of a wisp of smoke where Hoodie had disappeared. She remembered him doing something like this during the fight. It wasn't quite the same as his other technique to become smoke. This ability moved him somewhere as quickly as Joe's own shadow step did, but didn't seem to turn him to smoke to do it. Joe looked around the room and saw another wisp of smoke about halfway to the exit of the building. With a clear trail to follow, with a direction in which to aim it, Joe let herself feel the anger welling up within her in all of its intensity. She let it fuel her. How dare this guy hurt her friends just to call her out? For her benefit, as he had said. Impulse overrode fear and good judgment. Without replying to her sister, Joe shadow-stepped after the mysterious young man, following the trail of breadcrumbs that he had left for her. Joe was still a little worn out from shadow-stepping so much earlier and her outburst of soul at Wilson's, but she didn't have to go far. In less than a minute, she found her challenger nearby in an area of undeveloped woods not too far from the town center complex. He didn't react at all to her arrival, simply standing there in the crisscrossing shadows of the trees and their leaves, waiting. His head hung so that his face was still hidden by the shadow of his hood. "So," Joe asked him as she rolled up the sleeves of her overshirt and cracked her knuckles, "do you have something to say to me, or should we get started?" "Oh," Hoodie said menacingly, "don't worry. I have plenty to say to you, but I have a point to make first." "Get started it is, then," Joe replied, stepping back into her back stance. Hoodie didn't react in the slightest. He didn't shift his stance. He didn't raise his guard. He kept his arms limp at his sides and his head hung so that his chin touched his chest. There was no way he could even see Joe, and yet she felt like he could, like his eyes were on her and unblinking. Accompanying that feeling was the sudden sensation of cold, just like Joe had felt at the start of the match back at the Mega Dojo. The two sensations together were enough to make her skin crawl. Not being one to stand for such things, Joe distracted herself by making the first move. She shifted her foot so that her toes intersected one of the shadows of the trees around her, and she flickered out of view, shadow-stepping instantly to stand just next to her opponent. During the shadow step, she was able to shift her stance dramatically without being seen. She reappeared with her right fist raised, arcing toward her opponent's face. However, to Joe's genuine surprise, the very instant that her shadow step ended, her opponent disappeared in a puff of smoke. Joe got the sensation of movement past her. She swiveled in place just in time to knock her opponent's hand to the side. He had made to strike at the back of her neck, knife hand, and he had almost succeeded. As soon as Hoodie's attack was deflected, Joe shadow-stepped again. She darted around her opponent, slowing several times just enough that when she sped up again, she left a latent image in her opponent's eyes. Finally, before those images could fade, she stepped behind her opponent and attacked him again. It should have worked. Hoodie didn't know Joe's techniques, and she should have been able to confuse even his sixth sense by so thoroughly confusing his eyes, but he swiveled in place almost casually, twirling his arms like a windmill, knocking Joe's strike astray. Then he turned in place, dropped low, and swept her legs out from under her before she even knew what was happening. As she fell, he kept low and spun on his heel, driving a kick backed by his momentum into her side. She was sent tumbling away across the lumpy, leafy ground. Disoriented, Joe rolled and bounced once, and then again, before she managed to get her bearings. She shifted her weight, righting herself and leaping quickly to her feet, facing the hood fighter. He was already charging at her, his arms held back at his side like something out of Naruto. He came in low, and then, at the last second, leapt upward, swinging his knee at Joe's face. She brought her hands forward to deflect it down and away, but the moment she touched his knee, Hoodie brought his hands around, intending to clap her over the ears. She leaned back and out of Hoodie's reach, letting herself fall into a backward somersault that put a good 7 or 8 feet between herself and her opponent. This time, Hoodie kept back. In fact, he seemed to slide away from Joe, as if gliding, just as he had more than once in his heart-to-heart against Jen and Tucker. As he did, he turned and dipped his hands into the pouch of his sweatshirt, and then brought them back out with a throwing knife between each of his fingers. He threw 2 of those knives at once, and Joe rolled to the side, dodging them by mere inches. Her opponent adjusted his aim, and he turned again and tossed the next 2. By now, Joe's shock at the sight of the weapons had abated. She shifted casually to the side to avoid them. Hoodie turned one more time and threw the next to last knife. Joe was still mid-movement. She didn't have many options to dodge, so she shadow-stepped, shifting position just out of the knife's path. She never could have guessed that her opponent would predict this, and predict where her shadow step would take her, throwing his next knife with expert precision right at the center of Joe's chest. Joe could have avoided this last knife too. Her shadow step was a versatile technique, and she had practiced chaining shadow steps together. She had done so to reach Tucker's house less than an hour ago. In that moment, though, with a knife thrown unnaturally fast, bearing down on her so close that she could feel the air moving out of its way, her practice was forgotten. She reacted out of desperation, lashing out with her more reliable right hand, deflecting the knife off of it. As someone who had been born with a strong soul, and trained much of her life to make that soul even stronger, Joe was always in some way protected by that potent energy. There was always some amount of it flowing through her body, making her a little faster, stronger, and more durable than she otherwise would be. Even though she had yet to call her soul into her hands or create an aura, her hand was defended. It didn't suffer as much damage as it could have. That, however, is saying quite a lot, considering how much damage she did take. She struck the knife with the pinky side of her hand, and the knife cut deep before it spiraled away. Joe did her best to no-sell the injury, but she couldn't hide it. Her entire arm was shaking, and she could feel blood running from the wound down her fingers. She wouldn't be able to use the hand properly again until it was healed. Joe took a step back and stepped into her back stance again, reversing the stance so that she favored her left hand rather than her right. She used the familiar movement as a chance to center herself, but Hoodie didn't intend to give her time to get her bearings. He did another of his own brand of step technique, and suddenly he was right on top of her again. He drew 2 more knives from the pouch in his shirt and began striking swiftly and precisely, aiming for the vital areas throughout his opponent's torso. Joe twisted her body back and forth, just enough so that each of his attacks missed, if only by the slightest amount. She misjudged a few times ever so slightly, suffering shallow nicks to her arms and shoulder, but they hardly penetrated her overshirt. Finally, even with just one arm, Joe was able to nail down her opponent's movements well enough to catch one of his reaching arms, twisting it to the side, using it to deflect his other arm as well. She held onto his arm, turning on her heel and tossing him clear over her shoulder. As she did, she willed her energies to mix, and her aura sprang into existence around her. As her opponent hung in the air, out of contact with the ground and therefore unable to use his smoke step to move himself out of the way, Joe held her one good hand out in front of her, palm forward. Soul sparked down her arm, collecting in her palm, forming a large orb of pure soul that condensed down to the size of a baseball, vibrating with enough power that every tree in that little woods shook violently. One-handed, the technique was weaker than the last time she'd used it in a heart-to-heart, but it wouldn't matter. If this attack landed, it would end this fight, or it would leave him open for Joe to finish it a different way. Joe drew her hand back and then gestured toward her opponent, compelling the orb forward, calling out, "Soul Breaker!" With a thunderous crack, the attack spiraled through the air. It flew true toward its target at the speed of a bolt of lightning, yet Joe still had more than enough time to worry and to wonder. Against almost anyone else, her attack would land in this scenario, but Hoodie wasn't a normal opponent. He was a soul taker, cut from the same cloth as Karen, and Karen would have been able to escape this. There was every possibility that he could, too. The attack drew close, and Joe watched it with bated breath. It was inches away, and then an inch, and then a fraction of an inch. Just when Joe was sure that she could relax, that she managed to repel another soul taker threat against all odds, she was taken aback when her opponent had transformed again, completely into smoke. The Soul Breaker passed right through him, trailing remnants of his smoky form. It hit a tree behind Hoodie, and then another, and another, ripping through all of them before spiraling upward into the sky and out of sight. Meanwhile, the smoke swirled back together and curled toward Joe, reforming into Hoodie with his face only inches from hers. Finally, Joe could see her opponent's eyes, and yet later, when she tried to remember what they had looked like in that moment, all she could remember about them was how piercing they had been. In that brief moment where their gazes locked, Jo could feel him peering into her mind and into her soul. Suddenly, all of her fears and all of her anxieties began to stir beneath the surface as her opponent rooted through them against her will. Then the hooded young man broke eye contact with Jo and shifted his head just enough that she could see the lower half of his face again. He smiled and said, "Joanna Seeger, I know what you're afraid of." Jo stumbled away from him, disoriented, her entire body shaking. What did he mean? What had he seen? Thinking quickly, there was only one thing that came to mind. Ever since realizing her feelings for Karen, Jo had been wondering how to deal with telling her friends and family about them. She kept telling herself that she was only nervous because Karen was their enemy, but deep down she knew that that wasn't the truth. She didn't know how they would react to knowing that she had feelings for another girl, and the thought of finding out had her terrified. Was this the fear that Hoodie was talking about? If so, why did he care? How did he plan to use it against her? If it came down to it, if it was a choice between this secret getting out and protecting her friends, Jo was sure that she could make the right choice. But that didn't make things any easier in that moment. Her opponent had been in her head. She had felt him digging around, making himself privy to her secrets. She hadn't been able to keep him out, and it had shaken her. Taking advantage of Jo's disorientation, her hooded opponent uttered a quiet, maniacal laugh and swept another knife from his shirt. Before Jo even realized what was happening, he spun in place again and threw it full strength. By some miracle, even in her confusion, Jo had managed to retain the flickering dredges of her aura, so when the knife struck her in the gut, it didn't go as deep as it could have. Roughly half of the 6-inch blade sunk into her flesh, and she was knocked back, barely managing to keep on her feet. At first, as her aura finally collapsed, Jo didn't even realize what had hit her. She looked down to find her white tank top stained with her blood. She was so surprised that she didn't even see the knife there for a long couple of seconds. Then she did see it, and it was all that she could see. Hoodie walked slowly toward her, but she didn't notice. Without really thinking it through, Jo reached down and grabbed at the handle of the knife. She pulled, and pain shot through her entire body. She gasped and lost her grip. As Hoodie drew closer to her, she reached down desperately to grasp at the knife again. She didn't know what would help to get the knife out, but it was still all she could think about. Hoodie raised his arms to strike Jo with a finishing blow, and yet, even then, she didn't even bother trying to defend herself. Thankfully, she didn't need to. Just before Hoodie could strike, a fierce cry rang between the trees that gave him pause and drew his attention. "You!" Sarah roared. "Get the hell away from my sister!" Before Hoodie had a chance to react, Sarah was on top of him. She kept her arms in close to her body, poised and ready to either strike or defend. She moved like a ballet dancer, shifting from toe to heel as she twisted and spun her way as far within her opponent's guard as she could, launching precise, rapid, rabbit punches at any exposed points. Hoodie shifted his stance, twirling his arms, deflecting one strike after another, but Sarah kept pressing him. She had caught him off balance, and before he was able to recover, she managed to hit him twice in the chest and once in the gut. He stumbled back, and Sarah followed up with a kick. Her opponent managed to avoid it by the skin of his teeth, by smoke-stepping back from her, deeper into the woods. Meanwhile, Jo barely even registered her sister's arrival. She yanked the knife from her flesh with a yelp, tossing it limply away, and dropped painfully to her knees. She was the daughter of one of the foremost soul healers in the world, and yet the nature of her soul as an unnatural soul meant that she couldn't rely on any life energy but her own to close her wounds. She couldn't draw life from the earth the way her mother could have in this situation. That left Jo with only one choice to recover quickly enough to matter again in this fight. She had just enough presence of mind remaining to force her soul and her life energy to mix once again. But this time, rather than wrap herself in her soul, she wrapped herself in life energy. She was surrounded by an aura of glimmering golden light, and instantly the pain in her abdomen began to lessen. She looked down and saw the wound on her hand slowly mending, too. Jo's moment of relief didn't last, though. Almost as soon as her golden aura came into existence, she heard her sister cry out in pain. She looked up and saw Sarah rolling, sprawled out on the ground. Her left arm had been grazed by one of the hooded fighter's knives, and he had used that as an opening to catch her with a flurry of knife-hand strikes that sent her tumbling. Jo stumbled back to her feet, ready to rush to her sister's rescue, not even considering for a moment that Sarah might not need her to. Sarah pushed herself to her knees and grabbed at the ground with her right hand, pushing her fingers down into the dirt. "Life," she declared, "from the earth." Joe could feel a large portion of the planet's very own life energy flowing into one point and being drawn into her sister's body. The wound on Sarah's arm closed instantly and she rose to her full height. She wasn't any taller than she had been before, but somehow, as she stood there radiating golden light, she seemed much more imposing. Hoodie even took a defensive step back, intimidated by the vast amounts of new soul that was rolling off of her as a result of her technique. Sarah raised her arms and motioned toward herself. The air around her became heavy as she drew all moisture from the air around the entire mall complex into that place in the woods. A moment later, that moisture condensed enough that it was visible, hanging above Sarah's head. She spread her fingers, and the water split into dozens of smaller pools, each about the size of a beach ball. She clenched her fists, and those little pools condensed down further into fist-sized chunks of jagged ice. Finally, Sarah punched toward the hooded young man. When she did, those floating chunks of ice surged forward one after another, raining down on her opponent from above. He reacted instantly, turning in place, tendrils of smoke pouring from beneath his sleeves. They swept out wide and snatched up the knives that Joe had dodged and deflected, and then they retracted, drawing those knives back. Holding onto them via the smoky tendrils, Hoodie whipped his knives back and forth rapidly, deflecting each of the icy chunks in turn and shattering them. While Hoodie was distracted by her ice, Sarah rushed forward. She motioned toward the ground, drawing moisture from the plants at her feet and sending it over the top of the uneven dirt to freeze into a smooth sheet of ice. She slid along it, leaping up as she drew close to her target, and slung a barrage of kicks at his chest and head. He was able to pull back and defend at the very last moment, but that's when she sprung her trap. As Sarah jumped, the ice at her feet unfroze and followed her upward. There wasn't much of it, but there was enough for her to direct it forward, wrapping Hoodie's feet and legs and arms and hands, ensnaring him before he had recovered his footing. With a triumphant smirk on her face, Sarah clenched her fist again and that water refroze, likewise freezing the hooded fighter in place. Joe walked over to stand by her sister, stepping carefully to avoid jostling her wound. Their opponent, through the shadow of his obscured face, actually seemed to look himself over and assess his situation. And then, to the surprise of both sisters, he nodded appreciatively. "Impressive," he said. "Against any other fighter with my physique, this would be the end of the fight." Before Joe and Sarah could even process his words, their opponent once again became intangible smoke and slipped right out of the grasp of Sarah's ice, reforming just between it and the girls. They took a step back at the same time while Hoodie lunged forward, his hands poised to strike, aiming for Joe's wound. Sarah slipped between him and her sister again, deflecting his attack. Meanwhile, Joe refocused her soul and her life energy, mixing them for as long as she could stand, inflating both, feeding more of her own life energy into her healing aura and causing it to swell larger and glow brighter. The stress of it was extreme, giving her a migraine and causing her vision to tunnel, but it sped up the healing process considerably. The result was messy. Later, when she checked, Joe found that her wounds hadn't healed cleanly, leaving behind noticeable gnarly scars, but it got her back into the fight. In Joe's mind, that was all that mattered. Joe's healing aura collapsed and was immediately replaced by her chaotic black and purple soul aura. Even though it was less intense this time than the last, Joe slid her foot into the shadow of a nearby tree and shadow-stepped right back into the fray. Just as their hooded opponent managed to break through Sarah's guard, Joe planted herself at her sister's side and deflected his next strike. Without even having to think about it, the two sisters began to attack in turn, Sarah striking low with her swift attacks while Joe attacked high with more power. Their opponent managed to keep ahead of even their most well-coordinated attacks by virtue of his strange way of moving. He continued to slide as if he were gliding, slipping back out of their reach just before they could hit him. Despite the amount of pressure they were putting on him, he was even able to, on a few occasions, reach inside their guard and strike them back, wearing them down. Hoodie, meanwhile, never slowed down. He never faltered. His stamina seemed limitless, giving him the impression of some faceless monster, a force of nature that simply can't be outrun. Despite this, the girls continued to press, ignoring their own injuries, and before long their dedication seemed to pay off. Sarah managed to successfully feint, catching the hooded figure off guard, popping him in the jaw. He stumbled, and Sarah pressed, scoring several more hits which, while less substantial than the last, were still effective. Meanwhile, Joe shadow-stepped, zipping around her opponent in an erratic circle, building momentum. Sarah nailed the young man with one final combo, handing in a powerful upward kick as it sent him flying. As he hung in the air, Jo finally directed her shadow step at him. Backed by the momentum that she'd generated, she reached him well before he could act, driving her knee into his gut and sending him flying toward the ground. The landing would have been even more devastating than Jo's attack, if their opponent had ever felt it. An instant before he would have hit the ground, Hoodie became smoke again. The smoke kept most of his momentum, scattering out wide along the ground. It hung there, clinging to the underbrush for several seconds before it began to pull back together, swirling into a column that took on the hooded young man's form once again. He stood there, his arms limp at his sides, his head hung. From the way he carried himself, he seemed completely unaffected. "You can't beat both of us," Jo told him, trying hard to hide how much she doubted her own words. She refused to let her opponent see how much he had shaken her, waiting, staring him down with as fierce an expression as she could muster. And after a few seconds' pause, Hoodie responded. "Maybe I can't," he replied, "but you two can't beat me either. You've shown me your entire arsenals, and not a single one of your techniques has managed to cause me any serious harm, which," he angled his shrouded face toward Jo, "is the point I wanted to make to you. As I'm sure you've realized by now, I represent the interests of the Soul Takers. My attack on you and your teammates was to show you that you don't have the means to damage me, that trying to repel me with violence is pointless." "We would have gotten you eventually," Sarah insisted, glaring at the darkness beneath the Soul Taker's hood. "Would you have?" Hoodie asked her. He cocked his head. "I would estimate that, in addition to using my smoke step pretty sparingly, I held back from attacking openings in your guard roughly half the times that I noticed them during our last exchange. Assuming that, working together, the two of you would have been able to cover each other half of those times, that would put me at about 75% of my full potential in the latter half of this heart-to-heart," he reasoned. "And that's without my aura. In other words, I was far from giving my best effort. Can you two say the same?" Jo and Sarah traded glances. They couldn't be sure whether Hoodie was telling the truth, but if he was, it spoke volumes. Neither of them had been holding back. If he had been, even a little bit, it meant that he might very well be their superior. If he did have an aura that he could summon on top of that, he definitely was. Even fighting together, they might not have been able to find the opening they needed to win. Their assertion that he couldn't beat both of them at once simply wasn't true. "There are more of us," Jo declared, remembering that Jen and Tucker were still nearby. "Yes," Hoodie agreed. "There are. That's why I showed you how precise I am with my knife techniques. If all four of you try to come at me at once, I will not be as sparing with them as I was in this exchange. One or more of your friends will be hurt, or worse. Do you want to take that risk, or should we talk instead? After all, now that I've made my point, that's all that I want." Jo and Sarah were taken aback. That was the last thing they'd expected their opponent to say. They looked at each other again. Sarah actually seemed, barely, more curious than she was angry, which told Jo that she was interested in hearing the guy out. "Why should we trust you?" Jo asked the hooded Soul Taker. "You shouldn't really," he conceded. "You have no reason to at all. I could be lying about all of this. This entire conversation could be a stall tactic, buying me time for some reason or another. I can only state the facts. Whether you choose to believe them or not is up to you, but the fact of the matter is, I couldn't care less whether or not you and your allies are bearers of 4 of the 12 ancient soul fragments. It isn't my job to care about things like that." "And what do you want with us?" Sarah blurted, anxious for Hoodie to get to the point. "I don't want anything with you, not specifically," he answered. "I simply think that you might be my means of locating the people I'm actually after." Jo already knew the answer before she even asked the question, yet she asked it anyway. "If you aren't after us, who are you after?" The hooded young man tipped his head again, enough that Jo could see his characteristic wide, toothy smile spread once more from cheek to cheek, and he answered, "As if you haven't already guessed, I'm looking for some mutual acquaintances of ours. Karen, Monty, and Lawrence, former members of the Soul Takers organization."